Now, tomorrow, South Africa will celebrate Human Rights Day in memory of those that died at the hands of the police in a massacre in 1960 while protesting against the past laws under apartheid. They gave their lives while agitating for a non-sexist, non-racial and a democratic South Africa. Joining us now to discuss how far South Africa has progressed on the human rights front, almost 20 years since South Africa became a democracy in 1994, are Dr. Pregs Govender. She's the Deputy Chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission. Later on in Cape Town, we'll also be joined by Hugo van der Merwe. He's the Research Director at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Dr. Govender, very welcome here on Beyond Markets. Thank you for joining us. Let's start with a look back. You know, the current situation paints a bleak picture. We've seen a lot of reportage on the kind of police brutality that we've seen. We see socio-economic rights not, you know, being felt by very many people in South Africa. But we have come a long way. In your mind, what are the milestones looking back nearly 20 years into democracy on the human rights front?
Karima, I think we've done very well in terms of South Africa's constitution and our Bill of Rights, which is recognized and respected across the globe for upholding not just civil and political rights, but socio-economic and cultural rights. We've signed UN conventions, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And most recently, we've moved to ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So at the level of policy and legislative framework, we've done very well as a country. I think it's very interesting that this discussion comes just after listening to the previous guest and his discussion around economic policy issues. And one of the challenges is how do we actually look at human rights and look at our progress on human rights without looking at the impact of macroeconomic policies such as trade decisions on human rights. And if I take some specific examples, let's take women's rights and let's take the increase in gender-based violence and the vulnerability of women and girls, the increased vulnerability of women and girls to gender-based violence that we're seeing. What creates that vulnerability? And one of the factors is not just poverty and unemployment, but precarious employment. And we've seen the issue of if we're changing our macroeconomic policy, how do we actually measure that against our constitution? Who evaluates the impact of macroeconomic policy on human rights? It's a question that we put recently to Director Generals who met with the Human Rights Commission. And we said, where is it happening? Where is the impact of macroeconomic policy actually in terms of human rights, in terms of our constitution being studied? So the increase in, if you look at the increase in terms of poverty levels, particularly amongst women, girls, the increased violence levels, the increased inequality levels, there's connection. There's connection between all of that. You can't separate things in neat little boxes, because as a country, I think what the National Planning Commission has recognized is the lack of planning, is the lack of coordination.
Okay, Dr. Govender, let me bring in Hugo here. Hugo, you have just joined us in Cape Town. Of course, Dr. Govender, making that link between socioeconomic rights and the ability of South Africans to access the rights that are enshrined in the various documents, whether it's our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and so on. The thing that I wanted to focus on is the kind of violent nature of our society. We've seen increases in police brutality. We've seen poor communities, when involved in protest action, resorting to violence and being at the receiving end of violence from the police. And of course, we can't take those violent incidences and take them out of the context of our society that in many ways, you know, is a manifestation of the violent past that we come from. What is it that continues 20 years into democracy that drives that kind of almost endemic violence in South Africa?
Thank you very much. And I think what I want to say is just building on what Pregs Govender has said, that essentially the questions of the formal rights have been very well covered by the South African Constitution, by our legislation, It's at the level of implementation, at the level of making these issues that are alive, that are part of our culture in South Africa. And I think it's at that level that we do need to acknowledge that we come from an apartheid past where we have a legacy of so many of kind of the deeper embedded challenges, the questions of a socioeconomic discrepancies, the deep inequalities that we haven't addressed through our 20 years of democracy. We have state institutions that were inherited from apartheid that have largely carried on with a similar culture of impunity, a culture of heavy-handedness, where it's not seen as a service delivery process, but as a state asserting its authority in relation to citizens. And alongside that is, I think, an embedded understanding of violence as a way of dealing with problems, that we are dealing with problems at an interpersonal level, where the state deals with problems of public protests through resorting to violence. That is something that that has become almost a habit amongst South Africans, and that's both on the side of the state, but also amongst the public, where we're confronted with difficulties and we resort very quickly to violence.
Pregs, let me bring you in here. The police recently came under, a lot of public scrutiny in the aftermath of Marikana, of course, and then also just the incredible incidents that are often captured through social media of incidents of police brutality. And of course, when we see that, we are all outraged, and many South Africans believe that it's not what they are about. And we often forget that South African police men and women are, before they are police, they are South African men and women, and we have to locate their violent psychologies within the context of a violent, past and a very violent present. How do we break that cycle of violence in building institutions that have a respect for human rights against the pressures of a state that is often criticized for not acting tough on lawlessness, on criminals, on people who actually violate the rights of citizens through violent acts, whether it is assaults on women, whether it's house breaks, whether it's violent hijackings, because there is a tension there, isn't there?
Absolutely, and I think it's important not to simply scapegoat without looking at the causes and without looking at the line of leadership and the line of political messaging. So, if, for example, in 1994, we talked very strongly about demilitarizing the police. It was a very strong government decision, a very important government decision in terms of the militarization of the apartheid state and what that militarization had meant for everything from police action against communities to gender-based violence. And you saw that in the way in which women prisoners were treated differently to men, the sexualized nature of their torture. So I think that militarization, we said, was very important to remove in our context. Yet in the last few years, there had been a remilitarization of the police. So the police has moved from being a police service to being a police force. And that sends a very problematic message to police, ordinary policemen and women on the ground, who do face huge numbers of pressures without the necessary training, without the necessary capacity, without the necessary resources. So you have cutbacks, budget cutbacks on important critical areas. And you have the same thing happening where they're expected to actually deal with service delivery protests, where people are really angry when they see their children dying of waterborne disease, which is absolutely preventable across this country. So what we've seen in our hearings on water and sanitation, for example, is that poor people are not respected in terms of their right. They're invisible, their voices are not being heard. Hugo,
last question goes to you. If one looks at the kind of road ahead, Pregs has just sketched the kind of knee-jerk reaction, I suppose, of the political leadership against, very real, tough expectations to deal with crime. If one talks about dealing with poverty, for example, going forward, and this increasingly tough approach and only having a law and order approach to say, let's say, public order policing and protests, what is the prospects in terms of building a human rights culture going forward, given the fact that inequality gaps are in fact getting bigger in South Africa?
Yeah, I think we're facing a dual problem. On the one hand, there's the socioeconomic inequalities that offer a serious challenge to people's belief in the democratic process to address their problems. On the other hand is the engagement between citizens and state institutions, where we have formal democracy where people can vote, where there is a legitimate process of elections, but not a system where people feel that they can engage government, where there is thorough consultation about government policies and processes, where there's a process of accountability so that people, when there are problems, they know who to go to, they know how they can hold government accountable. And that is particularly a problem in the police force, where there isn't a sense of a trust. There isn't a sense of legitimacy of a police that can offer an effective service and that is responsive to community complaints. And that is across the kind of various government departments where that's a challenge, but it offers a particular problem in a context where policing is heavy-handed, where the citizens are losing trust in the police's ability to control crime, but also in the way that they do it.